for this attention to someone else's work, we find that we get this. We get stability, we get history, in this case, his personal history, relatives, ancestors, and the importance of recognizing his elders. He told me, she sat at this table. This is how he feels about the table that he rescued. There's purpose gained, perspective, vision, clarity, focus, peace, and a reflection or an analogy of the self in the painting. And certainly an abstract understanding. And I should also add that at first he had really difficulty connecting to the work, not having much feeling for the content, as I had mentioned. And in fact, he had no feeling for the scene necessarily, that people in their Sunday best holding parasols. It just held very little appeal. But of course, if you dig a little and then catalyze this insight in a discussion, the floodgates open. And so now that he has this tool called art healing, now that it has a name, he told me he's very motivated, very, very motivated to seek out works that he's not just avoided and doesn't like, but has had a visceral reaction to, because he knows that there is marrow to be sucked out of this art for him personally, the marrow of personal meaning, a perspective-giving matrix for enriching life and for quelling pain. And so art healing, and in fact, this work by Wyeth, he mentions Wyeth, and I found this work. I would imagine for the patient, the person, that this sort of imposing perspective, perhaps a work like this, I could, if he were, say, not just a reader, but somebody that I would see in psychotherapy, it might motivate my own consideration of bringing an image like this into the therapy, or it's suggesting that he go seek out the very works that have irked him, if indeed he wants to explore this further, and so forth. And so art healing puts a frame around a long-standing scene. I have just showed you that we can paint without painting, and we can sculpt without sculpting. And so we move from a case of spontaneous art healing, what I'm calling spontaneous art healing, to a more directed art healing with a patient in my office. And I should just tell you, stop for a moment and tell you that typically I should outline what I'm about to say before I say it. So very simply, I will now tell you about this case in some detail, this case of patient where we have used art healing together. And then I will outline a bit the rationale for art healing and in general terms, why there is a place for art healing as a tool. And then very briefly, I think, the 6 functions of art healing, what I've seen as the 6 functions of art healing. And then finally, there'll be an addendum later where I will describe what happened recently in New York, where I've been meeting regularly with a famous artist in an uncanny synchronicity. So this patient, Bill, and I took separate travels to the art museum. I asked him, this is a patient I've seen in psychotherapy for years. Also, I also manage his medications. I treat him for depression. I've asked him to go through the museum once with an eye towards what he might click with, and then to return to the works and hang out with the works that seem to have the greatest impact in him emotionally, and hang out with them later. And of course, for as long as he wanted or could. And he came up with this work titled The Myth of Division and Separation, and this is by Morris Colgraves, 1940. Now, I'll take you through this approach using just a couple of the 6 functions of art healing. So, the aesthetic function is really the most, I think, intuitively obvious function. Now, I did not have to coach Bill much about how to do this work. And I left some of the instructions vague because after working with this 60-year-old man who lives alone, he describes himself as predominantly gay and has worked for years as a university librarian. I knew that he would find his way without much assistance from me or some superimposed structure. Now, I should say a little bit about Bill's mostly relevant history. He has had at times severe bouts of depression. In fact, I've sent him for evaluation for transcranial magnetic stimulation. We've also considered ECT. But ultimately, it was my words, our relationship, and the work we had done communing with art that propelled him out of his most recent episode prematurely, obviating the need for shock treatment, antidepressant augmentation, or the dreaded prospect of ECT, the dreaded for him prospect of ECT. This is a man who's told me on many occasions how truly suicidal he had been, but indeed, truly, thanks to the work together, he no longer feels this way. And in this case, I believe with my heart that what he says is true and accurate, and that he was truly in a desperate state when I first started working with him. So this man from early on felt out of place, at a remove from others and others' expectations of him. A man with an acute sensitivity to his environment and a kind of searching for relief that has persisted, feeling isolated not only by his sexuality, especially at the time of McCarthy, growing up in the rural Midwest, but he has confronted the feeling of the shapes and colors in the Morris Colgrave's work. In his words, these are colors I gravitate towards. Colors I gravitate towards. Even here, as is typical for him, as is typical for the kind of relationship that we've had, he asks me questions out of a kind of deferential insecurity, such as this one about the colors. He says, would you call them muted if they're dark? There's always this question. Now, he felt a closeness, even a kinship with the colors themselves, and explains to me that he once took out on his own curiosity something called the Lusher color test. I don't know if you remember this, the Lusher color test. I learned then that this was a test where the colors you felt most comfortable with were thought to possess profound psychological relevance to you as a person or your experiences. He told me the colors I picked were the same ones refugees picked after World War II. He described the coloration as bleak. And interestingly, bleak is the very word he uses to describe his feelings at the nadir of each depressive episode. And yet, he also recognizes this. He says, when someone else looks at these colors, they might see it as truly bleak, but not me. To me, it's not bleak at all, but it's a comfort. It's a comfort. So if we move to the symbolic function, there's a recognition of the bird-like figure here. This is a critical recognition, and arguably how the patient best connected to this work. He identifies generally with animals, and in particular birds. They are so innocent and beautiful, he says. This patient once showed me a photograph, this very photograph, of one dead bird, and another bird appearing to scream in mourning, as though the one bird most surely recognizes the loss of the other, the loss of its mate. Bill recognized the line in the center of this work as the horizon line, and unhesitatingly referred to the separation of above versus below. He calls the radiating circle on the right the sun, where when I saw it independently, after he called my attention to this very work, I tended to think of that circle as mind. But as therapists working with patients, you can see where interpretations of the symbolic function may become commingled. And this may not be bad necessarily either. But you can begin to anticipate, in fact, you can begin to anticipate